I'm not sure if you're familiar with a guy called Lex Fridman and his podcast. If you're not, then I strongly recommend that you go and have a look at it. Some really interesting guests that he's had over the years and some really interesting topics of conversation as well. A short while ago, he had a guy called Nic Carter on his podcast talking about the typical sort of topics that Lex talks about, quite technologically focused usually. But on this particular occasion, toward the end of the conversation, Lex and Nic started talking about their views on communication, which I found quite interesting. Interesting, but radical at the same time, I would say. And I thought they'd be worth exploring in a little bit more detail. Now, why do I want to talk about this topic? I think the whole area of communication is just so important. You know, if we think about the important issues that we all face individually, collectively, on a global scale, on so many of these issues, there's such polarization, so much contention. And I think what we have to do is learn to find a way of going from contention more towards coherence and finding ways that are mutually acceptable for people to move things forward. So why don't we take a look at, it's about 1 minute or so, let's take a look at the 1 minute segment of the conversation and then we'll deconstruct it in a little bit more detail.
And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that there's that tension as a reader, that we appreciate the beauty and power of like complex weaving of words without assigning as much value to like actual clear communication of an idea.
And I'm always skeptical in speech as well. When someone will describe someone as articulate, I'm always immediately skeptical of the value of what that person is saying. Because if you articulate, you can make bad ideas sound very acceptable and great.
Yeah, Noam Chomsky has said this before. He, as a way to defend the way he speaks, he said that like he's suspicious of charismatic people because they can basically sell any kind of idea. He speaks in a very monotone and boring way, so that whatever the value his ideas have, it'll shine through. There's something to that. I
love that.
But it's a difficult journey. It's a difficult path because then I think it's the right path because ultimately you focus on the quality of your ideas, and in the long term that wins.
I agree.
Okay, so Lex starts off by saying it's unfortunate that as a reader there's this tension. So tension between what? He says on the one hand, tension between the beauty and power of a complex weaving of words. Beauty. Words can be poetic, they can be attractive, they can be awe-inspiring. Power, because words can elicit emotions in you. They can help formulate beliefs. They can actually mobilize you to action. So on the one hand, that's one side of the spectrum. Compared to what? Where does this tension come from? Lex says, well, we don't assign so much value to the clear communication of ideas, and that creates this tension. So what Lex seems to be suggesting here is that we can get lured, often unconsciously, into paying more attention to the beauty with which we communicate versus the clarity with which we communicate our ideas. It's a little bit like having a beautiful bottle of mineral water where the container holds more value than that which it contains. So I see Lex's point of view here. And actually, if you look at many political speeches, you'll see exactly what Lex means. A lot of fanfare and gloss and perhaps not as much substance as there could be. And then Nic mentions that he's skeptical in speech as well. So what he's implying here is that he's going beyond the verbal, the written word, let's say, more towards a delivery of the words in speech. And he says that when someone will describe someone as articulate, I'm always immediately skeptical of the value of what that person is saying. Because if you're articulate, you can make bad ideas sound acceptable. Now, when Nic talks about someone as being articulate, he means it in a slightly different sense to how I would use it. When I say that someone is articulate, I mean that they choose their words very carefully and string them together to make coherent sentences and phrases. So I mean it more in a verbal sense, whereas I think Nic means it more in a non-verbal sense. But that's okay. And Nic says that he's skeptical of what the person's saying. And this is important now because it's going beyond the point that Lex was making in terms of the clarity with which you communicate. Because Nic is now not talking about just clarity, he's talking about the truth of what you're saying. He's skeptical of what the person is saying, the value of what the person is saying. Lex then mentions Noam Chomsky and that he defends the way that he speaks. And by the way, if you haven't seen any videos of Noam Chomsky, I recommend that you pause this video right now, go and do a quick search and find some videos of Noam so that the rest of this will make more sense. So Lex says that Noam Chomsky defends the way that he speaks because he's suspicious of charismatic people because they can sell any kind of idea. Agreed. I think it's okay to be skeptical, be suspicious of well-articulated people, charismatic people, yet force them to justify what they're saying. Make sure that they're not glossing over the content of what they're saying with a beautiful rhetoric or the way that they deliver their communication. By all means, do that. But then Lex goes on to say that Noam Chomsky purposely talks in a very monotonous and boring way. And the reason being that he believes that whatever the value, the truth his ideas have, they'll then be able to shine through. Implying here that you don't want anything to detract from or outshine the truth of the idea itself through the beauty with which you communicate. Okay, I guess that's Noam Chomsky's prerogative. But this is where my major disagreement with Lex now stems. Because Lex goes on to say, I think it's the right path because ultimately you focus on the quality of your ideas and in the long term that wins. And Nic says that he agrees. Look, I think we'd all agree that it would be better if people could communicate their ideas, especially if they're on important issues. If they could communicate their ideas with clarity, this would allow people to better understand what they're saying and therefore be better positioned to evaluate the idea. But Lex and Nic seem to be going a little bit further than this. They seem to be agreeing with Noam and suggesting that everyone should take Noam Chomsky's approach, that everyone should talk in a very monotonous and boring way so that we don't detract, or there's nothing that can detract from the value, the truth of the idea itself, and it will allow that to shine through. So nothing can outshine the truth of the idea. If Noam, Lex and Nic want to talk in this way, then that's totally up to them. However, if they are suggesting in any way, shape or form that it would be better if all of us took this approach, all of us started talking on very flat monotone in a very boring way, then I have to totally disagree with what they're suggesting. I mean, just think about this. Everyone talking in a very boring and monotonous way, often not even with any eye contact. What an utterly boring world this would be. Yes, I think it is true that it's easier to communicate with beauty using techniques like rhetoric than it is to communicate with clarity. I think this is a big issue that needs to be looked at, yes. And yes, I agree that beauty can be used to compensate for or to distract from a lack of truth in the idea itself. Yes. But I think it's a logical fallacy to then generalize this to beauty can only be used to compensate for or detract from a lack of truth in the idea itself. Sometimes, no doubt, this happens, but not all the time. You know, I've got two young boys at home. One's age 9 and one's age 12. Let's say that I want to explain something to them. Let's say that I want to explain why we have 2 tides per day and yet we only have 1 moon. Now, am I more likely to be effective in my explanation if I take the Noam Chomsky approach, or if I take the Richard Feynman approach? If you haven't seen any videos of Richard Feynman, again, this is the time to pause and go and have a look at Richard Feynman. The way he explains things is just so much more attractive, so much more engaging and interesting to listen to. And this is the key. Watching a Richard Feynman video, he holds my attention. And because he holds my attention, I'm better placed to understand what he's saying and therefore to evaluate what he's saying. So someone like Richard Feynman uses beauty when he communicates, not to compensate for, not to detract from, but to enhance what he's saying, to enhance understanding, to enhance evaluation. So for me, the way forward isn't truth over beauty, as Lex would have it. For me, it's truth and beauty working together in harmony to enhance understanding, enhance evaluation of what you're saying, enhance the truth of what you're saying. And actually, I think Richard Feynman is a great role model for all of us here. I often ask myself when I'm struggling to articulate exactly what I want to say, I often ask myself, how would Richard Feynman explain this? Now, as the Greeks knew full well, there is a third element that needs to be considered here. So not just truth, not just beauty, but goodness as well. You've got to have good intentions when you communicate. You've got to have the well-being of others at heart. You've got to be able to put yourself in their shoes, really see things from their perspective, really inhabit the world as they inhabit the world, or get as close as you possibly can. And once you've done this, you've got to work in an earnest way to come to some kind of coherence in the way that you look at things and in the way that you're going to go forward. So personally, I think the way forward is to communicate your truth with clarity, with beauty, with goodness. And I think this would make for more interesting, more engaging, and more productive conversations. And perhaps for a better world. This channel is the audience's journey and is devoted to cultivating such conversations.